I guess I should say Martin Va, Ros, Ishbel and Alfie are there in Scotland. Kia ora, Frederik, thank you so much and for having me along. And kia ora koutou, hi there, everybody. I think I know more than, well, about half the people in the room. And so I'm so pleased to see you, and those I don't know, I'm pleased to be joining here. This is a very humbling place to be, because I think the day belongs to the animation and it belongs to the Impact Incubator. And, you know, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session afterwards. So thank you for doing me this honor. It's actually very humbling, because I think there's so many other people in the room doing great work in this space. Thank you to EAWOP for organizing and initiating the Impact Incubator, which I think is a brilliant idea, an idea whose time has come, and you know, couldn't be more timely and more urgent in a way. I also want to acknowledge the small group meeting that I think Ros mentioned that took place in 2018, which is for me a bit of a predecessor to this, and there's a continuity between the things that EAWOP has done to, I think, to up the game in IO psychology to respond more to these big global issues and local issues in the world of work. So thank you for that. And you know, I want to acknowledge that meeting in Glasgow at Adam Smith School in 2018 really had a big influence on me. And I see many people from that meeting in the room here who probably say the same. And here we are. I just want to quickly acknowledge as well Project GLOW, the Global Living Organizational Wage Net, which I'm humbled to be a part of. And there are many of us in the room here tonight, as well as other folks from other groups. So that's where I kind of belong at the moment, but I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, so I went to I mean, it couldn't be more timely, this event. This is just an item of news that I picked up just before this meeting, less than probably a week or so ago, from the OECD, which is part of its Risks That Matter survey that's done, I think, annually. And this is across 25 countries, it admittedly restricted to the OECD, but 25 countries, quite a lot of people. And the report is really saying, you know, that feelings of insecurity run deep, and then zeroing in and saying the risk of entrenched economic security is paramount for a lot of people. You can see there, so many people have had their lives turned upside down, affected greatly through their work, but of course that ripples into wider life. And these are the OECD countries which are relatively well off, and they're being severely perturbed. And I'm sure that the shockwaves are at least as strong in other countries around the world from which people are joining us tonight. So it's just a slide to say, look, you know, we really are in a very timely space here with living wages, because the report is mentioning the fact that people have had, not only were they on low wages before the pandemic came, and we know that was the large majority of the world's working population of 3.3 billion people, but many of them have had pay cuts since then. So if anything, the need for living wages has gone, as accentuated. Ros, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. And in that context, I mean, Ishbel and Ros, I know, have written, they wrote a piece for the Psychologist in 2020, which was titled "Living Wages Are Crucial Now More Than Ever," and that was never more true. And that's a really stirring piece that I would urge people to read, as well as the excellent review in the EAWOP journal, European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, which is entitled "Money's Too Tight to Mention," which I think was a Simply Red song at some point, but it's too tight not to mention in a way, and that's the irony in the title. The thing about me speaking here today, and I'm in a bit of an awkward spot, because the review is actually, you know, systematic review. It's covered the literature more or less to date. And I know there are other people in the room doing very innovative research that's coming through the system. And I'm not in a position to steal their thunder or talk about their work or your work. And the review has done an excellent job of summarizing this. The cutting edge is the title of the talk, my talk is, but really the review has done that. And so I'm in that position where I need to add something, but not simply steal thunder from others. And I mean, I do find, and I did find the review inspirational. I think it's going to be a seminal review for this field. And, you know, it did, and Ishbel's talked about the themes that it pulls out, the sustainability, capability, and externality. In other words, who pays the cost for low wages, and how does wider society pay for the harm that can cause? So I'm going to stick with those three themes, which I think are really cogent. And then the review itself talked about, well, okay, let's use those themes which have emerged through the literature to springboard into the future. And saying in the review, we need to keep on developing theory. We need to, and that's new theory and different theoretical lenses. We need to keep on developing different methodological approaches, multi-method approaches, and I know there's a lot of skill in the room around that. I know that from 2018 and from the people I work with on a daily basis. And we need to move into advocacy and action. And you know, your animation has, and Ishbel, you talked about this, and Ros too, of course, you talked about the multiple purposes and the free access. For me, it's going to be about that animation is going to animate and motivate new theory. It's going to capitalize on the old as well, and it's going to animate methodological improvements, and it's going to animate the degree of policy change and policy interface. So for me, again, you know, it's all about the animation and what's coming behind with the game, which is a new approach as well to getting the message about research and theory out there. So I'm going to try and stick with those themes and go off on a little bit of a walkabout with them, if I might. Ros, can you flick us through to the next one, please? Thank you. Yeah, before we go anywhere, I just want to, and I can't possibly do justice to everybody in the room and all the work that's going on out there. This is my humble attempt to try and summarize things as I understand them. And it's a very, very partial understanding in the sense of it's not complete. But we have got a lot more work going on now in work psychology. And, you know, you saw the bar charts go up from a range of different disciplines as well around wage and income. So it is too tight not to mention, we're taking money, wages and income seriously. We haven't done that really arguably in work psychology for quite a long time. And those are kind of like antecedents for me. And you know, we've got a whole range of, I think, pivotal human factors being researched by people in this room tonight. And I won't name you because you know who you are. But if I miss out your work, it's not for want of trying, because I know it's there. So there's a whole lot of work going on in and around the subjective experience of precariousness, right? And that's turning out to be a fairly major pivotal human psychological variable in this equation. And I don't mean equation in the strictly quantitative sense. This is just a rough sort of working understanding of how all the things that are turning, all the cogs that are turning, an awful lot of research going on fairness. I know Ishbel's work on fairness and you know, organizational justice, the wider field there. Awful lot of work on trust as well. I know Ros is working in the space, and there has been for a while, and there's a lot of work going on in the trust sphere, and work around job attitudes, for example, a lot of it around happiness at work, you know, work engagement and so on, job satisfaction, facets of happiness. That I think that's the one that I'm probably most closely involved in. I'll talk a little bit about later. Work around measuring people's capabilities and taking them seriously by measuring them, you know, in terms of fit between the job and their own capabilities, and the gap between that's going on in countries like Philippines by Joy and her team. So I know about work in that space. I know there are people in the room working in the informal sector, a number of you doing brilliant work in the informal sector, and the roles that are informality can kind of shift things. So I guess in my brain, these are kind of a bit like mediators, moderators, but they are contextual factors that surround work and life, and they matter a great deal. And there's a lot of work going on in the informal sector, and also great work going on around questions of identity. So intergroup, intra-group, all the social identity stuff that we know about in psychology, but also identity in terms of, you know, younger, older, male, female, men, women, different genders, different ethnic groups, forms of identification and diversity generally, and how wages and income intersect with those. And then very important, and I think something we've left out of psychology for way too long, spirituality. So I know that there are major teams in the room here tonight working in that sphere, you know, for example, looking at Buddhist perspectives on decent work, on living wages and so on. And you know who you are, and I've known you for many years, but the you know, BSRI, for example, and you know, I've got Minyu in the room here. There are a number of people who are working in that space of spirituality and spiritual beliefs, and how they can intersect, of course, with the ideas about decent work, what matters for people. And then at the other end of, I guess these are, for me, consequences or consequence, but things that happen as a result, you know, the ripple effects, the waves that happen as a result of wage and income conditions and decent work generally. So things like work-life balance, which Ishbel talked about and the animation talks about. Financial strain, which is getting a lot of attention now as an actual factor in itself, because so many people are under it. We saw from that OECD report, economic strain is close to financial strain. Feelings of inclusion versus exclusion, you know, access to decent work can end up making people feel much more included and participating. Ishbel mentioned participation in wider society. And then into domains like happiness in life, as well as, you know, happiness at work, but happiness more generally and all the facets that are there. I guess a term that gathers a lot of these up is well-being. And I know the ILO is more interested now in well-being, I think, than it has been for a while. And into those sort of organizational level variables that Ishbel talked about as well, retention at the in the organization, productivity, efficiency, and so on, but then out to that wider level of civil society. So this is a very important slide for me, because I'm trying to say, I know there's a lot of work in the room around these. And to some extent, we are working a little bit separate from one another, but we're also connected through events like this and through the animation. And I think the incubator is going to fast forward those relationships, because I think these pieces of the puzzle actually all fit together. And there are people in the room working in that space. And I'm thinking, you know, things like efficiency around cost benefit analysis. I know people in the room working on very innovative approaches there. And let's not forget, of course, the whole ethical framework in which this the question of living wages sits, which is really, really important, was big in the 2018 meeting. So I hope I've done appropriate homage to the work that's going on, and I haven't said things that aren't true or omitted too many things that are true. I'm just trying to say this is my limited understanding of the state of the field where it is right now and the exciting directions in which it's going. Ros, can we flick through to the next one, please? Yeah, so I'm gonna step back from that a little bit and say, well, look, you know, one of the questions, it was actually Inez that made me think about this question the most, and as you posed it to me, who actually gets to decide what sustains people at work in their own jobs and work and so on? Who gets to decide? That's a question of power, I guess. But perhaps one of the things that happens with living wages is that we tend to get told there's a number, and the number often comes from a cost of living survey, a food basket approach, which makes assumptions about people in society and what they like to consume and what they need for everyday life sometimes in a sort of commodity material sense. And we end up with a number, and the number in New Zealand is living wage in New Zealand is currently set at $22.10 New Zealand, right? That's a single number, it's a single datum. It's often set econometrically through these cost of living surveys and so on, not always, but often. And I would call that a living wage, capital L, capital W. So it's a single datum, which is set econometrically. And then people argue about the number. Is the number the right number? Is it too high? Is it too low? And then when it's implemented, there are evaluations made of what it was like before, what it's like now. Two numbers, but it's essentially that it's still evaluating that single datum. I would distinguish that living wage, capital L, capital W, from small l, small w, which is actually a much bigger idea, which is that, look, a living wage, as we saw in the definitions there, in the animation and in the slides thereafter, it's a concept, it's a big idea. It's a level of remuneration that actually keeps people going in more senses than material, keeps them at a decent standard of living. And it's that wage or above. It's not a single datum, it's an idea of, and the actual living wage, the $22.10, may or may not be that number, but it doesn't have to be. The same with a minimum wage, capital M, capital W, another single datum, legal minimum wage, often set in that kind of econometric way. And that is a single datum, but the minimum wage as a concept is about sustaining some kind of social protection, safety net for people, not to make sure they don't fall below it. And none of these values, the small letters, big letters, is actually the same as the next. For example, a number of years now, Oxfam has been doing quite a lot of research, releasing figures showing that the minimum wage in many countries, capital M, capital W, is not actually a minimum wage, small m, small w. In other words, it doesn't provide that safety net it's supposed to in terms of putting just a minimum amount of food on the table. And a living wage, similarly, capital L, capital W, may or may not actually sustain a livelihood, i.e. be a living wage, small l, small w. And I guess from a work psychology perspective, the first thing we would learn is, and remind ourselves of, is work psychology research 101. Is there a link between how that wages are a number, they are a quantitative number, but is there any relationship between the way those numbers vary and the quality of life and work life that people have, perhaps in terms of their well-being or something like that? And that doesn't have to be a number. Clearly, it can be a number of different, it can be qualitative quality of life, but it can be a number if you try and quantify it. So what I'm trying to say here is I think if we step back from that question, who gets to decide what sustains people, maybe we can find fresh ways of doing that. And I say fresh reservedly, because if Ros, if you can put the next slide up. Yeah, when I got sent a message from a researcher in China recently. I'll mention his name later on, but he sent a reminder that somebody called Peter Townsend, who's a sociologist, was looking at this question of relationships between income and kind of well-being back in 1979. And I guess we've got to be humble. I've got to be humble enough to say I knew a bit about Peter Townsend's work, but I didn't know enough. And what Peter Townsend did, he worked in the UK. He did household surveys across the whole country with large numbers of households and people. And he constructed what he called a deprivation index. If you look at it on the left-hand side, it's things that mattered to people in the UK in 1979, but it was things that about not being able to have a small holiday away from home in the last year, and not having a refrigerator, not being able to have certain types of food and so on. And he was able to construct this deprivation index and interviewed households about it. And then was also looking at household income, which was calibrated as a percentage of supplementary benefits, that's government payments for being unemployed and so on at that time for a household of that size. So, the more it was like supplementary benefit level, the harder it was, and the more it was above, the better off people were. And that was creating, I think, very cleverly, a yardstick. And if you look at the graph, which is one of the most famous examples that you'll see, the axes are a little bit counterintuitive, but you've got income on the x-axis and you've got deprivation score on the y-axis. The higher it goes, the more deprived you are in terms of the scale on the left. And if you start from the right-hand side of the x-axis, as income diminishes from the highest to the lowest, so as income goes down, deprivation is steadily increasing, as you might expect. But below 150%, about 140% of supplementary benefit at the time, deprivation starts to climb really rapidly. There's a steep drop in people's standards of living and increase in their levels of hardship. And Townsend called that a break point, because if you look at the curve, it flexes, it inflects us, I should say. It turns a corner, and that corner is not a very good corner to be turning if you're going in one direction, and it's a very good corner to be turning if you're going in the other direction. And that idea of a break point, to me, conceptually, and it's a break point that only emerges when you plot the graph, right? It jumps out at you when you plot the graph, is what the living wage concept is, for me, has always been most consistent with conceptually. It's an idea that there is a threshold that you need to get people over in order for them to start prospering and thriving. And that's a bit like what they call the big push theory in international aid, but it's the idea people need to be at a certain level before they can sort of self-generate their own capacity, which is their inherent capability and agency. So, Ros, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, and if we can fast forward now to the sort of work that we've been doing across Project Glow. And this is linked to Peter Townsend work, but it's framing it slightly differently. If we look at what's happened in work psychology, looking at the link between wages and well-being, we've tended to assume linearity. So we haven't assumed the kind of curve that Townsend was finding. We've tended to assume linearity, and if that's a wrong assumption, we'll underestimate the relationship between money and wage and well-being. And we've also tended to focus on middle class occupations rather than lower and working class occupations. So we've missed a bit out of the curve as well. So we might have missed quite a lot. And when you look at that literature, the literature that is there, it kind of says, well, money's not that important. We need to look at the more psychological stuff. But then if you look closely at that literature, it shows that people on, if the literature that does go to people on lower incomes, that link is a little bit more strong. And anyone who's worked in a low income job knows that wages do actually matter a great deal for how you get on. And so we might have missed quite a bit. So if we go back to basics and do that, you know, that kind of curve analysis, if you like, we've got, if we look at capability theory, for example, this comes from an article that I was a co-author on in the ILO's International Labour Review in 2016, at least 3 possibilities. One is a linear link, the black straight line. The second is the just noticeable differences line, which is diminishing marginal returns, actually, which is the idea that any wage is a good wage, and especially perhaps a low wage that increments a little bit each time because there's a big gain for that small increment, relatively speaking, a very, very noticeable difference. That's a just noticeable difference, diminishing returns prediction. And the third prediction is the solid blue line, the S shape there, which is really a poverty trap. That basically is a bit more like Townsend's line, I think. It's saying that there is, you know, at the very low levels of income, people are going to struggle. Whatever you do, they're going to be below the waterline, which is indicated about the middle of the left axis, vertical axis. They're going to struggle unless you get them up to people get up to some decent threshold level and they can get their head above water rather than keep going backwards and caught in effect a working poverty trap. And the living wage will be at that threshold. You know, that threshold may be empirically determined, will be where they start to say things are looking better. And if we look across to the right-hand graph, and the line we got actually uncannily resembles the symbol for SDG 8 that Ishbel mentioned, which is kind of like if you add a little flat bit on at the front, rise, pause, and rise. It's flat, then rises, pauses, then rises. And you can take variables that we've, for example, job attitudes like work satisfaction we've looked at, but we've also started to look more at well-being. I'll put some information up about those in a minute. But the pattern's been quite consistent. This pattern has been found with GLOW colleagues, by GLOW colleagues in South Africa, more recently in China, and also in New Zealand in multiple studies as well. So it's not yet a pattern, but there is a little bit of a pattern that fits that green squiggly line, which is a bit like the S-shaped sigmoidal function on the left. And the rise, flat rise, pause, we don't quite know why yet, but it may be something like that's the point. When people are just starting to make it, that's when predatory industries like credit card debt industries may pounce on people. We don't know that yet. There are maybe other things going on. But it's certainly not a simple function. It's not linear. It is curved. And if you put working classes in there, you start to see stuff that I don't think work psychology has been seeing too much before. Sociology, yes, maybe, but not very much in work psychology. Ros, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and this is from Robert Walker, who's the fellow who wrote to me from China, pointing out about Townsend work, and has also been working off the shoulders of Townsend's original ideas in the UK. Large survey here, 40,000 people, again from sociology rather than work psychology. And I'm not going to dwell on the figures, but this is where you start to see those wider kind of variables that people in the room are experts in work psychology, and Walker and co, Ferragina et al. Have been looking at social participation and trust, for example. If you look at they're called Vigantiles, they're 5% increments of income on the x-axis, and the dotted line, you start to see that S shape popping out again, kind of like a working poverty trap at one end, and then a rising, and then a slowly leveling off. That's really another instance, I think, of that point of inflection, that breaking point that Townsend was talking about, which I think the animation is saying you need to get over this line. And here is research from other disciplines as well, I think, triangulating into that space in an interesting way. Ros, can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, this is a slide from a study that we've been conducting here in New Zealand. We were given a Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden Fund grant to look at living wages across 3 years from 2018 to 2021. We finished earlier this year, and it is a multi-method approach. So we've got qualitative approaches, case studies, interviews with employers, as well as surveys with employees. We've got qualitative and quantitative data in the survey as well. Survey in 2 waves, one in 2018, one in 20 in the midst of this pandemic. So the pandemic wasn't anticipated, but it has created these opportunities, if you like, for us to look at living wages in a different way. This is some data from 2018, actually, and it's showing something that I think was worrying me for a long time, and now I'm not so worried about. I'm much more comfortable with. You know, lines of central tendency, whether it's an S shape or whatever. Not everybody, in fact, most people aren't sitting exactly on the line. It's a central tendency, and there's maybe no such thing as a completely average person or household or whatever. And the combined attitude scale on the left is a range of big 7, basically, job attitude scores from job satisfaction through to work-life balance. But it's got, you know, organizational commitment in there. It's got OCBs, and it's got affective commitment, as I mentioned, meaningful work as well, and work engagement, a range of different attitudinal variables. And they've been combined into one meta kind of attitudinal score, but on the basis of factor analysis. But the point of the chart is we see the line of central tendency. You can sort of see the S shape on the left-hand side, the flat zone, then the rise, a bit of a pause, and then another rise. But we called it an outliers paper in the end. It's a paper in which we started to look at the accounts that people were giving in the survey of how well their wage was working for them. That was the question. How well is your wage working for you? And if you look at the 2 shoulders, the 2 blue shoulders in the graph there, the top left, that's people who were on very low wages, but they were actually saying they're quite happy at work. And on the bottom right, you've got people saying, I've got quite a good hourly, this is hourly wage, it's not a perfect measure of wages. I'm getting quite good hourly rate, but I'm not very happy in my work. And then if you look at the things that people are saying, you start to get a sense of why there's that spread around the central line. So at the top left, people are saying things, well, I haven't got a good wage at all, but my partner has got a really good wage, so I'm okay in that respect. And plus I work in a really good work environment. We've got supportive leaders, supportive colleagues, and it's really good. So that's why I'm happy. So, you know, we're getting that reminder, the living wage is not everything. It's still important, but it's not. Decent work is the wider concept, and so is life circumstances, yeah? And if we go to the bottom right, we've got people saying, I'm getting good money, but hey, there's a big conflict going on at work. I've got, you know, not very nice supervisor or leader. Plus I've got worries at home, and all of that's spilling over into my work, making me not very happy. So again, we're reminded of those wider life circumstances, but also, you know, that wages are one element of decent work conditions, not the only one. And still the central tendency is still there. And when you look at the, you know, at higher wage levels, there's more people saying they do feel protected, they can make the ends meet, and we'll get to that later on. But the point of the moral of the story, I guess, is that the general and the particular coexist. Yeah, a living wage is still a very good idea for a number of reasons on the average, and it works for a lot of people. We'll see, especially for people on one income in the household. And so it still works, but we always have to keep that decent work agenda in mind as well. You know, it's one size does not fit all. And that applies to methodologies as well, which we'll see in a moment. Ros, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. This is from the same paper, really. It's just what we did was we went through the different segments of that central tendency line and looked at people's narrative accounts of how well their wage worked for them, from people at minimum wage or below, just on the minimum wage, then between the minimum wage and the living wage, and then above the living wage. And that's across the top of the table. On the left-hand side, we've got less other income. In other words, only one wage coming in, versus more other incomes, like the story of someone saying, well, I've got, you know, my partner's got a decent wage, so we're kind of okay. And the box in that chart, that what you see is that the stories that people tell tend to fit the picture on the curve, yeah? And if you go to the one that really is the most moving for me is the one at the top right, where this is somebody who's now above a living wage, the campaign living wage at the time. And they're saying we're finally able to catch up a bit on necessities we missed out on. It's almost as if that's somebody looking down at the curve where they've been, and they feel like they've got out of that sort of danger poverty trap zone and things are much better for them. So for me, this is a reminder. And again, I think it owes a lot to the small group meeting that was held in 2018 in lots of ways. But it talks, and all the things I learned there about multi-method approaches and so on, but it's really saying, look, number and narrative. People's life stories are mattering hugely here. They're telling us that, in this case anyway, that living wages can be transformational. Okay, Ros, can we move through to the next one, please? Thank you. I just wanted to show you this one in terms of trying different methodological approaches. In the pandemic, we've seen that, that idea of, they call them excess death curves, where you superimpose the curve for morbidity over a curve from a previous year and so on. They were able to estimate the extra losses that we had through the pandemic. Well, this is an inversion of that. We've called it excess capability curves. And it's really using visual means to have a look at what happens when you lift the minimum wage to get it closer to the living wage. And New Zealand's quite unusual, I think, in that regard, because prior to the pandemic in 2017, when the current government, Labour-led coalition government, was elected, it had promised to raise the legal minimum wage closer to to $20 an hour, which $20 an hour, which was pretty much the living wage at that time. And they've kept to that through the pandemic. So we had the survey data. It's 1,000 people nationally, a national sample of 1,000 people at each time point. We couldn't get the same people because people in precarious work cannot be tracked. They're moving in and out of different life circumstances. But we did manage to get a very closely matched sample in terms of demography and so on, and job levels and everything else. Quite a lot of work went into that. So we feel like the two groups are quite comparable at 2 points in time, one of whom where the minimum wage has been lower, and one where the minimum wage has been raised. And by superimposing, the red one is the one from 2020, the blue line is from 2018. And this pattern is replicated. I can't put the job attitude that's being measured here. And we've got well-being on the right-hand side, job attitudes on the left, but we've got well-being indicators like job stress, anxiety, depression, and so on. And on the left, a whole range of job attitudes. You can probably guess the classic ones that we've used. So it doesn't really matter which one. This is just one sample. And I can't put the whole lot up because it's under review and so on. And we were made to say we can't show any of the data, and it hasn't been peer reviewed, so it's put up here very tentatively. But when you look at the graphs, and this one is typical of the others, the graph seems to change, yeah? So you can see that there's a bit of a rightward shift of that S shape. The S shape is still kind of there. It's shifted a wee bit right, as you might expect, perhaps. The interesting thing is that the tail, the bit where people are trapped in poverty, has got kind of visibly shorter. And when you run the numbers through on the number of people who answer yes to a question, I'm struggling to make the ends meet, that number doesn't go up during the pandemic, it goes down during the pandemic at the time that the minimum wage is being raised to be closer to the living wage. Now, we're still trying to think that one through, but it's a different way of approaching this debate. It's not a single number anymore, it's an interval. It's about how close you can get one to the other. It's got a pandemic going on, and those are economic headwinds. And we've heard arguments. The arguments here were, if you keep raising that minimum wage, you're going to do so much damage. Well, the animation says, no, that's not the case. And this evidence is pointing, I think at the moment, pretty much in the same direction. The final increase was made in April 1st this year. Just, that was after the 2020 wave was taken. So we've run out of money to do the next bit, but we're working on getting another wave done so that we can track how the final increase in minimum wage, which takes the minimum close to the living wage, is actually going to play out for people's job attitudes, which we know are linked to things like not only to well-being, but also to productivity and their well-being itself. Okay, so thanks, Ros. If we can go to the next one. I just want to nod here to public health, because public health, and this is about externalities, which are again featured heavily and very nicely in the animation. externality, who pays the cost. This is from the New York Times. It's an article which is backed up by empirical peer-reviewed studies. And it talks about a living wage. This is research in public health, not work psychology, being an antidepressant. A lot of it's correlational research, but hey, there seems to be a link between living wage levels and antidepressant. Sleep disorders less when the living wage is higher. Stress reliever, preventing premature death. I saw recently a paper on suicides and wage levels, which was really sobering. So premature death. Shielding children from neglect. So those kind of statistics drop when their living wages are in place. And the last one I've highlighted in blue because it's a personal highlight for me. Okay, so I'll share it with you. Years ago, I was in Lima in Peru at the Inter-American Congress of Psychology, talking about work psychology. And somebody from the audience asked me, okay, so what can work psychology do to stop very early teenage pregnancies, often unwanted, in the favelas? What can you do in work psychology? And I struggled to answer that question. And, you know, if I could have fast forwarded back to the future or whatever to now, the evidence from public health showing that there is a link between living wage levels and preventing early teenage unwanted pregnancies, I might have had a partial answer to that question. And that for me is a personal kind of thing, but it takes me back in time, and it shows me, I think, that this kind of research and that the animation is highlighting can make work psychology much more expansive and inclusive and socially relevant. Ros, can we move to the next one? Yeah, I'm going to share another highlight as well. This happened quite recently in June 20, well, it's already not that recent, June 2020, but the research that we've been doing in the Marsden team, we were invited to go to a city council meeting at Hamilton City Council, which is a reasonably large city and large council area in New Zealand. Some councils here have implemented a living wage policy, which is like a bit like a minimum wage in a way. They're saying that you need to pay anyone who works for the council will be paid the living wage over $20 an hour, and all the contractors that come in will have to figure that wage into their contract bids. Otherwise, they won't get the contract. So you're kind of ensuring council employees and contractors get a living wage. Wellington City Council, the capital city, has already done one. Auckland, I think, is in the middle of doing one. Hamilton was thinking of doing one. And we were invited, our research team, to go along and present research on living wages to them. We were only one team presenting. So another council, I think it was Wellington Council, phoned in with their experiences. Some organisations, small to medium enterprises, were there talking about theirs of paying living wages and so on. So we were only one team amongst several. But we did make a presentation. We presented the research that had been peer reviewed, that's featured in the animation. And I wish we would have had the animation in the council chamber, because I think it would have made a more rapid and more impactful difference. But we didn't. So we had to fall back on the journal article stuff. But we presented it in a user friendly way, I think. And I like to think that we had a bit of an influence. We weren't the only voice in the room. But I like to think that we did have a bit of an influence. And at the end of the day, the council did actually vote to move to a living wage. And that I put that story in there. I'll share it with you because I'm very proud of it as part of the team that did that. I'm very proud of being part of GLOW that was sort of supporting that kind of work. And it showed me that we can actually engage with the cogs of policy making. And it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it was not a smooth ride. Inside the council chamber, there was heated debate, division and so on, and there often is around the living wage. We know that, and the animation makes that point. But at the end of the day, the evidence, I think, was part of the mix that decided that there would be a living wage in that community. And that to me is why I'm in this job. Okay, Ros, can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, and I want to sort of expand that point a bit. So if we're talking about council workers and then contractors, we're talking about supply chains. And I think work psychology needs to get more serious about supply chains. We often focus on single organizations. I'm working with a number of people around the room at the moment on supply chains for fair trade, but that's just one example. But that inter-organizational perspective, which I guess is about externalities in a way, but also internalities. And so GLOW's working on it, but I wanted to sort of put the slide up because we can see things happening in the wider world of work. So the Delios paper on the 2010 paper on the left-hand side, which was in Academy of Management Perspectives, was saying, hey, you know, organizations compete with one another and they can undercut one another, and that can drive wages lower, but they can also be courageous and dare to care and actually form coalitions to keep wages at living wage levels. That seemed like a bit ahead of its time in 2010, but it's less so in 2021. So Unilever, which is a massive organization worldwide, has already got a policy now around living wages by 2030 for employees, but also across their whole massive supply chains. And they seem to be very serious about that. And Glow is engaging with them to try and learn more about how they're doing it and why they're doing it and so on. Accor Hotels, I believe, is another one that's publicly come out and said, yes, we're moving to a living wage policy for ourselves and contractors. And then we move across the one on the right. You may not know what it is unless you live in New Zealand, but Ishbel may know, but and you too. But ANZ is ANZ, BNZ, Westpac, and ASB are all banks here, and there are four. There's another one that's in the mix as well, I think. These are the big banks, and they actually got together and they got the whole sector, the whole banking sector, to get living wage accredited, which meant that living wages would be paid. The minimum would be the living wage across all the banks, but also across all their contractors and suppliers. So that's massive. You know, that's organizations daring to care. And I think work psychology, through the animation, can actually engage with those processes more than what we're doing at present. Ros, can we flick through to the last one? Yeah, this is just reminding people. I wouldn't want to imply that the research I've been talking about with the Marsden team has been all about surveys, because it's not. I mentioned earlier, we've had, you know, employer interviews, which should be really informative, and also focus groups, organizational case studies, as well as the 2 survey waves. And one of the things that's emerged through the focus group work and the employer interviews is a rhetorical approach that's been taken by Darren Hodgetts and Amanda Younghauser, who are my close colleagues here in our team. They've been leading this, and it's really it's applying rhetorical analysis to the sorts of things that are being said by people in this discussion. And some of this, I think, is about wage negotiations moving away from the workplace in a way into wider spheres. So that would be, you know, employer associations, outside of there into the social media and so on. In a way, the debate about wage levels being set has exploded into the public domain. It's come out from that industrial bargaining context into a wider one. So some of the things people are saying in these interviews and focus groups, you can hear them being said in the social media and so on, blogs and so on. And so it's a different lens. It's a much wider focus, and it's looking at rhetorical analysis. And now I read Aristotle's Rhetoric years and decades ago, actually, and Billig's work on rhetorical psychology. So I'm not an expert. Darren and Amanda are, but their analysis is focusing on tropes, rhetorical techniques that are used to win hearts and minds, I guess, for one side or the other, and sometimes both. And I've got one example there. It's autonomasia, which is, I thought I'd put that in just for interest's sake. I'm not an expert in this area, but that's where you take a proper noun and you replace it with an epithet. So if you take Napoleon, for example, if you call Napoleon the little colonel, you're turning people away from, you're turning people against Napoleon there by doing that autonomasia. And, you know, some of the comments in the analysis are around that kind of autonomasic technique. So let's pay people for the contributions that they make. Is one quote that I can remember from the analysis, which Darren and Amanda are arguing is a form of autonomasia, because it's kind of alluding to, you know, the undeserving poor. So if people are paid less, it's because they're not working hard enough. It's kind of like maybe implicit in that rhetorical trope. I can't possibly do justice to the paper. It is under review, but I think what it is an alternative perspective that isn't inconsistent at all with work psychology today. It might have been 20 years ago, but it's not now. Fits with the animation, because the animation is about persuasion, right? The animation is a piece of rhetorical, as well as being based on evidence. It has to persuade people, otherwise it's not animating them. So I you know, that's where I'd like to stop, I think. Ros, I think we've got, how many have we got? We've got 2 more slides, but they're very quick. The last one is really just saying, I just want to reiterate that this is the animations evening, and it will shortly be the serious games evening. and the incubator, impact incubators time. So I don't want to take from that. And for me, that, you know, the animation has motivated me. And I think the connection that you made, Ishbel and Ros, to the SDGs is really profound. And I look forward to the Q&A. Kia ora, folks. Masa niva andrasta. Thank you so much.